so we're on our third and final video about Reconstruction. I think you're getting the gist of it, that this time period was trying to get South back into the Union. It was initially good for African Americans. Things were going well, and then it wasn't, especially when Reconstruction ended. So let's talk a little bit about some of the generals and what happened to those Southern generals, and then talk about how Reconstruction actually ends. Let's get started. Okay, this is former General Robert E. Lee. Trying to get the next slide to come up. There it is. Okay, so this is Robert E. Lee. He is very gracious after the war, I guess. Kind of said, hey, we lost. Let's figure out how to get back together as a country. And he really does urge Southerners to reconcile, you know, in this time period after the war ends. And he goes on to serve as the president of Washington College. So he has a good career as a college president after the war, and continues on. So definitely not punished for his, you know, battles in war. He is a good general for the South and lives a good life after the war is over. This is Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is one of our presidents. So he becomes a president in 1868. So if you remember, Grant is the one that wins the war for Lincoln. He's the final general. Lincoln finds that, finally finds a general that will defeat Lee. And so Grant is kind of credited for winning the war, and he pursues politics after that. And he's elected in 1868 and replaces Andrew Johnson. So remember, Johnson took over after Lincoln was assassinated, and then Grant gets elected president next. He does advocate for the rights of those free slaves. He wants those slaves to have the rights that white people do. Isn't obviously completely successful, but he does advocate for those rights. All right, so how does Reconstruction end? Remember, I told you it doesn't go on forever. We do bring all the Southern states back into the Union, so that's a really positive part of Reconstruction. But at the same time, the North can't control the South forever. Remember, they separate the South into 5 military districts. And are kind of like policing the South with those Union generals, or sorry, not the Union soldiers and generals too, but mostly soldiers are kind of like a police force in the South during Reconstruction, but that can't go on forever. Reconstruction does have to end, and this is kind of like the ending point for Reconstruction. The ending point was the election of 1876. Grant had, I believe, served two terms as president, so we needed a new president. During his terms, he had really advocated for the rights of the Southern African Americans. But during the election of 1876, we have 2 candidates. All right, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. So think of Republican as from the North. Okay, because remember, Republicans were anti-slavery. So these were, Hayes was more from the North. And then we have the Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden. He was more from the South, okay? So you kind of see what part of the country they're from. So we've got these 2 candidates in 1876. And this is the election results. Hayes had, of the popular vote, 4,036,572. Tilden has 4,284,020. As election goes, that's really close, okay? So it's not really far off to have only, 200 and something thousand votes off. So it's a really close election. And you can see here that obviously the Republicans were mostly voted on in the North, the Democrats mostly voted on in the South. All right, of course, you remember from 7th grade that it doesn't matter what the popular vote is. What really matters is the Electoral College, because that's how presidents get elected. So Tilden won 184 electoral votes and Hayes won 165. but neither of them got enough votes to actually win the presidency. Now, they didn't, 270 is the magic number today, 270 Electoral College votes to win. But back then it was a little bit less because there weren't as many states. But neither of them got enough to get the Electoral College votes to win the presidency. So what did they do? Oh, these were the states that were in dispute. Florida's always the problem child, seems to be, but Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina were in dispute. And each party said, we won those states. Like the votes were so close that we won those states. And so each party said, Republicans said we won, Democrats said we won. And what are they going to do? So who goes to the Electoral College to actually get enough votes to win? Well, what really happened was what they call in historical terms the corrupt bargain. There basically was a deal struck. And the deal said that the Union troops would have to leave the South. So since Reconstruction started, those troops were in the South and occupying the South. The first part of the bargain said those troops had to leave. Okay, so the South was not going to be policed by those troops any longer. And they also, at this point, were controlling the election boards. That would have to stop. So they basically said, we're going to fix the election so Hayes wins. So that was the Northern candidate. Okay, so we'll let you win. All right. And in return, you are going to, sorry, let me get all these up here real quick. So they're going to let the Northern candidate win. They're not going to dispute the results. The Republican candidate would win. The Democrats won't dispute the votes. They'll let the Democratic candidate win. Sorry, I'm getting confused. I'm sorry. They'll let the Republican candidate win if they pull all the troops out of the South. And they went for it. The Republicans said, okay, that's fine. So the Republicans got the win of the presidency. They got to have the election, but they also had to pull all the troops out of the South. And when they did that, all the policing of the elections and making sure that the African Americans got to vote went out the window, and it stopped happening. So things turned down for the South after that, and that's when we really start seeing African Americans being disenfranchised, meaning that not being able to vote, being segregated from whites, and the Ku Klux Klan intimidating people up into death for voting, African Americans for voting. So that was in 1877. Think about the time period. 1865 is when the war ends. This is 1877, so it only lasted about 12 years. Wasn't a very long time period to actually try to fix things really in the South. And that's when we have the Jim Crow era. Jim Crow laws, we'll talk more about those later, but basically those were all the laws that segregated society, made society completely separate. The KKK takes over power in the southern states. Those former Confederates kind of scare people into not voting. They segregate everything, and they find many, many ways to deny the rights of Blacks. And this is 1877. It's not until the 1960s, late 50s, mid 60s, that we had the Civil Rights Movement. So it was for a really long time that they were segregated, and that's a terrible, terrible part of our American history. And you can see a few examples of segregation, the white colored fountain versus the colored water fountain. Over here, we wash white people only. I mean, how crazy is that? So they would wash, kind of a weird sign, wash clothes for white people only, really is what it should say. White customers only for Coke. It's just a terrible, terrible time period. But this is when it starts, is when the Republicans said, okay, we'll get the presidency if we, pull our troops out of the South. And they did. So that was the end of Reconstruction. All right, so you got the basics. Got all the different parts of Reconstruction, trying to help the African Americans, find better ways of doing things. We'll get some more in-depth on certain of those topics later on, but hopefully you get a good overview of Reconstruction and what it was all about. And I hope you also followed along and filled in your notes as we were going. Alrighty, appreciate you listening, and I hope you have a fantastic day. If you have any questions, you let me know. I'll talk to you later.